Donald Trump has announced that he wants to withdraw the American troops from Germany, and he is of course meeting mixed reactions because in theory we all pretend to be pacifists who don't think much of the military and blah blah. And just as recent as May, the leading Social Democrats Rolf Mützenich and Norbert Walter Borjan demanded that America would withdraw the nuclear missiles from German soil. And the absurd thing is the Social Democrats are not just some fringe party. They are in a coalition government with Angela Merkel's party CDU. They are by and large just a lack of Merkel's reign. And these people pay lip service again and again to supposedly socialist values, which you will also find in some Muslim groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. Whenever they are a minority, whenever they cannot win outright through military action, they pretend to be pacifists, and then they attack Western troops whenever they advance. This is the usual pacifist strategy that you hear 95% of the time. But of course, the more intelligent people know that the United States do not just protect Europe as a whole and the Western world in general, but also they bring hard currency. I mean, quite literally, the military stations make a lot of money for the businesses around them. Donald Trump mentioned this in this very speech where he announced this. And also, he said that Germany is delinquent or remiss in paying the obligations to the NATO contract, the NATO treaty, which is, of course, correct.
So we have 52,000 soldiers in Germany. It's a tremendous amount of soldiers. It's tremendous cost to the United States. And Germany, as you know, is very delinquent in their payments to NATO. And they're paying 1%, and they're supposed to be at 2%, and the 2% is very low. It should be much more than that. So they're delinquent of billions of dollars, and this is for years delinquent. So we're removing we're putting the number down to 25,000 soldiers. We'll see what happens. But Germany has not been making payment.
When it comes to international obligations, our elites are very quick to point out whenever we are supposed to uphold them when it hurts their own population. But once these obligations are against their own interest, then they change gears completely, and then they feel absolutely no obligation to honor their treaties. That's also true for the Maastricht Treaty, which caps national spending to some degree, or the public debt is capped by that treaty. It's also completely ignored, and it's nice to see that the United States now have a president that knows to chase bills. It's currently 2% of the gross domestic product. You can argue that maybe this is too high, but I give you some more details so you get an understanding what the situation is right now, that maybe more money should be spent, what ways it could be spent, and so forth. So 2% obligations there are, and this is an international obligation our elites do not want to honor. They only want to honor some gender stuff, the United Nations Women Council or whoever have decided, or they want to honor some immigration stuff that the population hates. When it comes to their obligations, they are very remiss. Trump will be leaving 25 soldiers behind anyway, so you can expect that we will have some infrastructure left for the American troops to return anytime. And it is not a binary situation to begin with. My argument will be that, of course, a partnership and a military cooperation should continue. The form it takes is up to debate, because I feel also that NATO has become a bureaucracy, a deep state entity that is self-serving and is no longer interested in providing security for its citizens. I also feel queasy about NATO including Turkey right now, because they are meddling in Syrian affairs and other stuff that are not the business of the Western alliance. And the map has just shifted. And the map has just shifted since the Cold War. The alliance is now more with the Muslim world, with the Arabs. And they are sometimes very hostile towards Western nations. And if they provoke a conflict, I think we all don't really feel an obligation to help them out if they overplay their hand. On the other hand, we all know that Israel, South Korea, Taiwan, and so forth, they need our assistance, and maybe we should reorganize and rethink the way we cooperate militarily in future. For a start, a few numbers. So 25,000 troops will be left behind when America leaves. The entirety of the German army Bundeswehr is 180,000 soldiers, 53,000 of which are professional soldiers. There are time contract soldiers, Zeitsoldaten, 120,000 in numbers, and an additional 8,000 volunteers who are in arms. That's not very much for a nation of 83 million people, and it stands to question whether we should ramp that up. Last year there was a report on the material employability of the main weapon systems of the Bundeswehr, and it was titled exactly like that. Bericht zur materiellen Einsatzbereitschaft der Hauptwaffensysteme der Bundeswehr 2019. And that report says that lower than 40% readiness, that means the system does only work in 40% of all cases, or even in less or even less often, is the Puma tank. The A400M carrier aircraft, an H145M LUH SOV helicopter, a GTF CLF hard shell truck, and the NH90 helicopter. They are old, rather old systems. That means less than 40% of the mentioned systems will work, and 60%. So 60% of all these things, like the helicopters, the Puma tank, and so forth, they will not start. They cannot be employed on any battlefield. A readiness of lower than 50% can be expected from the Tornado fighting jet, the CH-53 helicopter, the Lockheed P-3C Orion. That's a maritime surveillance plane. America used to have that in the past, but I think since decades already, you have a new plane to kind of screen the oceans for submarines, for example. Then there is a tanker ship, class 704, that also is only ready in 50% of all cases. So that's a very bad record. And if Donald Trump says that 2% of the GDP should be used for the military budget, there's a hell load of machinery that actually needs to be repaired. I want to make the argument, though, that our problem is not so much the size of the budget, but it's our focus. We really have an issue with being undecided about how to deploy our troops. We don't really feel there is a necessity to keep all these tanks and helicopters and so forth ready. And that, of course, is a weakness in the long run. And in the past, that had been kind of cracked open a bit by the suggestion that maybe Germany should at least oblige to its NATO obligations and take part in the missions that other NATO partners are engaged in anyways. The issue, though, is that we have just bought additional tanks and helicopters and so forth, and are unable to maintain all these varied systems because we don't actually have any engagement in those different areas. For instance, France has a huge history with Africa, so therefore they are well equipped and well trained and have a great knowledge of the conditions in Africa, while we have not. We have lost 2 soldiers, I think that was last year, maybe the year before, because we sent a helicopter to the desert of Mali, and the helicopter could not stand the sand, so Ursula von der Leyen, who's now the president of the European Commission, sent our troops into an environment where the machines are not made for, and even the manual of the helicopter could have told her that she is risking the lives of her men, and she did it anyways. What we are lacking are troops that are working on our ground that would be capable of actually throwing back, let's say, the Russians, if the Russians dared to roll over Poland to attack us. or that Turkey, there was once a newspaper that made the remark that the Turkish forces could eventually take out ours. And there was a huge outcry, a hypocritical one, because, of course, from a purely military standpoint, that is true. From the strength of their weaponry and the size of their personnel and everything, so the Turks would be able to win over us militarily in a heartbeat, if it were not for all the alliances with America and so forth. But anyway, so we don't have anything to throw back actual troopers or throw back Islamist attacks in big numbers if they were somehow coordinated. That is the vulnerability we actually have to fix. And we are totally unfocused looking after what to do with the desert or the maritime surveillance. Instead, we have now a lot of gadgets that could theoretically be used for NATO applications but aren't. And they are not truly functions. There is no real motivation to keep them up and so forth. And the sheer size of it has also grown out of proportion. So much so that we have not enough soldiers to protect our own properties. There are currently contracts out of 430 million euros. That's about one euro is about $1. So 430 million euros are spent in private contracts that private security companies protect military properties. There are 400 properties currently that are guarded by 8,000 private security guards. We can't even deal with that. An egregious example of the total lack of focus of our military spending was the Gorge Fog, which Ursula von der Leyen tried to repair for a whopping 135 million euro. It's a 19th century sailing ship, and the cost, because of the poor management of Ursula von der Leyen, but also her predecessors, rose year after year, and at some point it reached the mark of 135 million euro for a ship that cannot be used in any battle whatsoever. It's supposedly used for some training, but you train soldiers on actual weapon system that would actually be used. Of course, likewise, they would not cut back on orchestras and other tools and games and stuff. So we have, first and foremost, a focus problem, and then also a budget problem. If you talk to a military person, he will most certainly just complain about the budget being cut back all the time, which is against the NATO treaty, as Mr. Trump points out correctly. So given that lack of focus, there are a number of ways to go about the contract requirements, the 2% budget of the GDP that Germany is obliged to pay into the military. One way to go about this would be to repair some of those very core weapon systems like the helicopters and the tanks, and additional other procurements related to the military that would be sensible. But given the lack of competence of our elites, I have a second suggestion which you keep in mind as I move forward, that maybe we should have a fixed fund that can be drawn from the Baltic state and Poland. They are the NATO state directly bordering to Russia. That these states can pull the funds proportionate to their GDP percentage or proportionate to their population percentage. And use for their military force. So I would pay into that fund the difference between the 2% GDP and the money the Germans are actually spending into their military. That was a bit complex, so I'm saying it once more. Maybe we should have a fund for the difference between the actual military spending for our national defense budget and the 2% GDP of the given year, and that fund should be drawable from the NATO states that actually border on Russia. That would be my suggestion, and you still have a way to to approach that line with your annual budget, and Germany can, of course, ramp up the spending in the areas where it's actually needed, and at the same time always fulfill its contractual obligations. I found a very interesting article by Stephen McQuire. He is a British Army officer working for the UK 20 Armoured Infantry Brigade, and he describes what is lacking at the Very High Readiness Task Force, that is the part of the troops, of the NATO troops, that can be pulled together in the border regions to Russia, and more specifically to the Baltic nations. And a Very High Readiness Task Force is crucial because there had been a report by the American think tank, the RAND Corporation, which estimates that maybe within 60 hours the entire Baltic states could be taken by Russian forces. And the task force is the NATO response to deter Russia from reaping the Baltic nations. And of course, everybody is nervous after what happened to Crimea and what happens to Ukraine in general. And what Stephen McQuire of the Very High Readiness Task Force had found out is that the troops are lacking capabilities to fight at night, so they don't have night vision, they don't have heat cameras, they also lack communication, and a lot of the 2% spending of the GDP could actually go into improvement of our infrastructure, of our IT infrastructure, into the cables to be laid and so forth. And that means there is a huge portion that even the pacifists have to pretend they like, because the wider population will enjoy the benefits directly. But as I said, the rent company had said, and McQuire is actually contradicting this, but I think they are actually right about that the Baltic states could be taken in within 60 hours, and the Very High Readiness Task Force, their response at the moment takes 10 days. And if Donald Trump removes troops from Germany, that does not mean they just disappear. They don't just evaporate. They could maybe be moved to closer places. They could be stationed in Poland, for instance. Of course, there's also this element outside of the pure weaponry and the number of soldiers on the ground, that you need a shared moral basis, which I understand is difficult to uphold if you have a player like Turkey that seems to do whatever they like, and therefore make the entire alliance of NATO very vulnerable. It is difficult to rally troops up, or to rally a population up to send the troops through their parliaments if you don't think it's worthwhile to save or to protect certain people. And yes, we have seen in the Ukraine already that NATO is not as cohesive as we would wish it to be. Ukraine is not a NATO state. There is no formal obligation, but one would have thought that maybe we would rush to their defense against an enemy like Russia. That did not happen, and the reason probably is that Ukraine is an unreliable partner. You had a people that is partially pro-Western, and they go a long way to trying becoming members of Western associations and Western alliances, formal contracts and so forth. They go a long way into that direction, but if you look at it, what stops you from actually committing to that defense is that they are extremely corrupt, that they don't abide to the values, to the standards that limit government, that allow freedom of speech, that allow security of business. I mean, if you look at it, they don't seem to abide to freedom of speech. They have banned Russia as a minority language in some places. They operate with quotas on the radio stations. That's limiting speech. The French do the same. I'm also very disheartened how the French sometimes deal with Western values, but that's a side note. And you don't have, and it's the most essential part, you don't have a legal stability. So if you make a contract with anybody in Ukraine, maybe it's honored, maybe it's not. And that had been a problem in the past, particularly when it came to the gas imports from Russia. They have not honored their payment obligations, and as a consequence, the Russians had cut off the gas supply, and as a consequence, southern and Central European countries also did not get their gas because Ukraine is a transit country. This has been a problem for a while. Trump is actually talking about the dependency issue from Russia. So let's have a listen.
But in addition to that, I was the one that brought it up. Everybody talks about Trump with Russia. Well, I brought this up a long time ago. Why is Germany paying Russia billions of dollars for energy, and then we're supposed to protect Germany from Russia? How does that work? It doesn't work.
So here, of course, he is referring to Germany becoming ever more dependent on Russia. We don't rely so badly on the pipelines, on the gas pipelines as the Ukrainians do, and that's why we don't have this oligarchy going on. But they, because there's so much power essentially aggregated in this one place, the supply of gas, that very few people can actually meter out the power between themselves, and that's of course to the detriment of any democratic functioning of the state. We don't have that so far, but the Green Party is working on it, and they are working on something called the Energiewende, the energy turnaround or energy transition. That's the current translation on Wikipedia. And that means they are shutting down nuclear power stations, they are shutting down coal mines, coal power plants, and so forth. So ultimately, we become ever more reliant on gas, because natural gas, of course, has a smaller CO2 footprint than coal. And as a consequence, we become ever more depending on Russia. The former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder is already on the board of Gazprom. And he had started this energy turnaround. And this is behind everything. Actually, these are Russian interests that come with this solar panel, windmill nonsense. And they know that the renewable energies, how these technologies are called, they are not renewable. Energy is not renewable. That makes no sense. They know that these technologies are unstable and that in the long run, gas will be used to fill in the voids. Contingent on that is the debate on the so-called Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Richard Grenell has come out against it, and so has Ted Cruz and a number of other American senators and so forth, and also the entire Polish government. Because they don't want to be left alone. They are afraid that what happened to Ukraine could happen to them if the power shortage would not affect directly the population in Central Europe, that maybe nobody would put his life on the line to defend the Polish and the Baltic states. And therefore, I say that we need a fund that allows these people to draw directly the military budget and use it for their own defense systems, because we ultimately won't get the crazies under control in any time soon. The East European countries, they have to take care. First and foremost, they can have the money, I would say, until we have dealt with the plague that the left has become. And I understand that they don't like Nord Stream 2, but also I don't want the energy to be cut off. So there's a trade-off, and Ukraine has just proven itself to be unreliable. They just won't pay the bills. They steal. It's just difficult to work with them. Right now they have, I believe, a good president, and they are moving forward. But it's very unclear how things are heading in the future. But in the meantime, I want the Polish and the Baltic states to be able to defend themselves on their own. We cannot rely on a moral bind that ultimately will break apart because the left is so suicidal, or it's not even suicide because they always think other people will ultimately get the hit, but they are so anti-Western and anti-American that I think they would not even budge if the energy falls flat and our economy goes down the hill. And also a very legitimate reason for the withdrawal of American troops is our incredible ingratitude and the outright hostility we have for America and for the soldiers sometimes stationed here. I mean, sometimes they are well accepted. I knew a lot of girls who dated American soldiers and so forth. Sometimes they are well received, but there is an extreme hostility towards military in general and the Americans. And Donald Trump, of course, and the Republicans, of course, and basically everybody who is not in California and in New York. That ingratitude must be addressed by public figures in America, and maybe even officials like Donald Trump himself. And you can see that with your bare eyes if you just look at the Spiegel magazine cover, for example. And right now there is a newspaper edition of Zeit that speaks of the Cultural Revolution. I mean, they call the current iconoclasm against the statues and the street names and everything that's now going on in the Western world, starting in America. Quite frankly, it's silly. And they are using this to whitewash the Cultural Revolution in China. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you soon. Bye.